I'm very excited tonight to welcome Peter Carey to Cambridge to read from his new novel, Parrot and Olivier in America. Mr. Carey has written short story collections, works of nonfiction, and 11 novels. He won the Booker Prize in 1988 for his novel Oscar and Lucinda, and again in 2001 for A True History of the Kelly Gang, making him one of only 2 people to have won the Booker Prize twice. Born and raised in Australia, Mr. Carey has lived in New York City for 20 years now, where he is the director of the MFA program in writing at Hunter College. Mr. Carey's newest novel, Parrot and Olivier in America, is an improvisation on the life of Alexis de Tocqueville. It tells the story of Olivier de Garmont, a French aristocrat sent to America by his parents to report on its prison system, and John Larrett, also known as Parrot, an Englishman who accompanies Olivier as his servant and a spy for Olivier's mother. As the two travel around the young United States, each comes to his own understanding of the benefits and dangers of democracy. Publishers Weekly called the book richly atmospheric, a wonderful novel injected with humor and insight, and the New York Times said of the novel, Parrot and Olivier in America grabs its subject and marches down Main Street, playing full out, provoking a reader's delighted applause.
Well, good evening. Perhaps I could ask those of you with carry-on baggage to go to the back of the aircraft and be a little smaller, lighter load, but perhaps more stable in what's to happen. I'm not really sure what to say to you at the start. How many of you have actually read Democracy in America? How many of you have read little bits of Democracy in America? There you go. You see, I was so slow to understand this. Because, you know, I'm Australian, of course, and I've been living in New York for 20 years, and Tocqueville's always sort of around one way or another. But I always thought, well, everybody told me, you know, we did this in school, or we studied this in college. And it was a long, long time before I realized that what had happened was you'd all read little bits. And, you know, school being school and college being college, you'd read the good bits. And so the notion that you had, from that part of your reading experience anyway, what might not have been so different from mine as the foreigner, which was, there was this French aristocrat who came to the United States in the 1830s and sort of really got it and really dug it and really sort of understood that everything was fabulous. And of course, for so many reasons, Tocqueville really did want democracy in America to be a wonderful thing, not least because he understood that democracy was the wave of the future, and no matter how many kings wished that to be otherwise, and no matter how many people wished to turn back the clock on the revolution, in France, I mean, it couldn't be turned back. And here was America, and for whatever reason he was really here. Here was America to present itself, and what might that be? What could he learn from it? What was his place going to be in the future? What could France learn from the United States? These things we sort of know, all of us. But he was also a man of his class at his time. And it's, people say, you know, well, Tocqueville was not a snob. Well, what's a snob? I don't know. But I'm an Australian, so I grew up with visiting Englishmen. Some of them were lords and ladies, and some of them were grocers, but they still basically adopted the same attitude towards us. And so one's quite sensitized to that. And so when one reads Tocqueville in the full version of the book, we see there's an awful lot of what you would expect. What a vulgar lot of people these are, and how uncultured. And so there's a lot of that that's certainly from my home and my place, and is terribly, terribly familiar. I suspect this little part of things doesn't get repeated a lot in school. And to me, it's not at all strange that it should be there either. It's quite natural. Why wouldn't he be like that? And also, there's a number of big questions that he has about democracy. Maybe you should just say not democracy in America, but democracy in a capitalist society, or democracy. But in the time that I started to think about this book, which was really the Bush-Cheney years, to simplify, when you see the things, and a lot of the things that Tocqueville was worrying about were exactly the same things that I was worried about. And I guess a lot of you were scared too. Maybe not all of you, but I was I think it was a very frightening time. I'm not saying it's not frightening now, but I mean, it was particularly frightening then. And you can see Tocqueville worrying at the notion of the rule of the majority. And where, also, to insist on my Australianness, again, I'm sorry, but I do have a US passport as well. I have two. And one, I'm trying to get one from Denmark, but I don't think they're interested. But, so the notion of the rule of the majority as an Australian, and with our particular history and our particular descent, our beginnings as a penal colony, and the notion that we were the convict stain and the convict seed, and how could you have a decent society based on us or our ancestors or our psychological ancestors. Anybody that starts worrying about the rule of the majority, I'm sort of against at the beginning. But I started, as one reads more calmly, one understands what he means. And living in the era of Sarah Palin, what one began to see that sort of Tocqueville's point was not just that it's America, anyone can be president, it was America, anyone can be president. So I engaged, if you like, with that idea and that possibility. I mean, my answer, just to reassure, I think if one had been arguing, if Parrot had been arguing with Tocqueville at this particular time, and maybe it's in the book, I can't remember, but one would have said, you're not to worry about the mob, you're to worry about the electorate, and in a democracy, the electorate will be educated. We seem to have forgotten about the importance of that particular aspect, and I'm not just talking about the United States, I'm talking generally that we're now in an era where we seem to have accepted the fact that the majority of people will be able to read their cornflakes packets, but not Virginia Woolf, say, and that that's just the way it's going to be. They're not going to read literature at all. And that's fine, and that's the future. And there's also a hole in the ozone layer, and that's another thing. So there was that, and then there was, well, I've really covered his other fear about the nature of culture in a mercantile situation where money was valued above all things. And I just felt reading, I just kept on seeing the present. And for a writer, it's very exciting, I think, when one sees the present in the past or the past in the present. And because it does mean really that history has some significance, and we will be who we have been, So, and I, as the 20-year resident of New York with 2 American children and an awful lot of continual involvement and passion and love and rage about where I was, thought I'd found a way to engage with a sort of an argument about democracy, but democracy in America, and I hoped sort of to have some fun along the way, and most importantly, I hoped to make not the most important work ever written about Alexis de Tocqueville, but the single most important book ever written about Olivier de Garmont and John Parrot. And it's got about 400 pages, I think. And it's very hard to read for 25 minutes and to somehow represent what I'm trying to do. So what I've done, you can tell me if it works or not, and then the people in Austin will have a totally different experience tomorrow. So they're little grabs. They're little. Excuse me, I'm standing here for a moment. Okay, I'm back. So these are little 4-minute, 3-minute things that really are trying to represent the story in some way. Hope it works. From the beginning. Olivier. I had no doubt that something cruel and catastrophic had happened before I was even born. Yet the Comte and Comtesse, my parents, would not tell me what it was. As a result, my organ of curiosity was made irritable, and I grew into the most restless and unhealthy creature imaginable. Slight, pale, always climbing, prying into every drain and attic of the Château de Barfleur. But consider this. Given the ferocity of my investigations, is it not half queer I did not come across my uncle's celery fare? What's a celery fare? Wait. Perhaps the celery fare was common knowledge in your own family, but in mine it was, like everything, a mystery. This clumsy wooden bicycle, constructed by my uncle, Astolphe de Barfleur, was only brought to light when a pair of itinerant slaters glimpsed it strapped to the rafters. Why should it be strapped? I do not know, nor can I imagine why my uncle, for I assume it was he, had used 2 leather dog collars to do the job. It is my nature to imagine a tragedy, that loyal pets had died, for instance, but perhaps the dog collars was simply what my uncle had at hand. In any case, it was typical of the riddles trapped inside the Château de Barfleur. At least, it was not me who found it, and it makes my pulse race even now to imagine how my mother might have reacted if I had. Her upsets were never predictable. As for her maternal passions, these were not conventionally expressed, although I relished those occasions, by no means infrequent, when she feared that I would die. It is recorded that in the year of 1809 she called the doctor on 53 occasions. 20 years later, she would still be taking the most outlandish steps to save my life. So my childhood was neither blessed nor tainted by the celery fare, and I would not have mentioned it at all, except here it is, before us now, I mean on the page. Picture. Typically, the Austrian draftsman fails to suggest the 3 dimensions. However, could there be a vehicle more appropriate for the task I have so recklessly set myself? One that you, by the by, have supported by taking this volume in your hands. That is, you have agreed to be transported to my childhood, where it will be proven, or if not proven, then strongly suggested, that the very shape of my head, my particular phrenology, the volume of my lungs, was determined by unknown pressures brought to bear in the years before my birth. So, let us believe that a grotesque and antique bicycle had been made available to us, its wooden frame in the form of a horse. And of course, if we are to approach my home this way, we must be prepared to push my uncle's hobby across fallen branches, through spinneys. It's almost useless in the rough ground of the woods, where I and the Abbé de Lalande, my beloved Bébé, shot so many hundreds of larks and sparrows that I bruised my little shoulder blue. Careful, Olivier dear, do be careful. Well, we can ignore nose bleeding for the time being, although to be realistic, the blood can be anticipated soon enough. Spectacular spurts, splendid gushes, my whole body being always too thin-walled a container for the passions coursing through its veins. But as we are making up our adventure, let us assume there is no blood, no compresses, no leeches, no wild gallops to drag the doctor from his breakfast. And so we readers can leave the silky, treacherous Seine and cross the rough woodlands and enter the path between the linden trees, and I, Olivier Jean Baptiste de Cléral de Barfleur de Gaumont, a noble of myopia, and free to speed like Mercury while pointing out the blurry vegetable garden on the left, the smudgy watercolour of orchard on the right. Here is the ordure of the village road across which I can go sailing, skidding, blind as a bat, through the open gates of the Chateau de Barfleur. Hello, Jacques! Hello, Gustave! Odile! I am home. Well, it goes on, of course. But we are not going to go on, I believe. And I made these notes while perfectly sober so I can rely on them. We will introduce Parrot, and I'm just going down here. Excuse me. Okay. So anyway, with Olivier, we introduced this young child who has grown up in the shadow of the terror of the French Revolution. His parents have just escaped. The father's hair has turned white overnight. The mother's will be sick and neurotic for all her life. The book understands Olivier as the child of survivors, and he will grow up in a house where he doesn't even know what happened. And in the first part of he will find out. He doesn't know what a guillotine is. He will find out. Parrot is a little older. We'll meet him at roughly the same age, but at an earlier period. I can't, for all the talk about voice in my books, I can't actually do the voices, you know. I could do it on the page, but not. So you've got to imagine that Parrot is from Devon in England, and all I can do is a sort of a half-bastardised Australian version of something. So please, it will be much more fun for you if you'd never heard me. So Parrot goes, "You might think, who is this?" And I might say, "This is God, and what are you to do?" Or I might say, "A bird." Or I could tell you, "Madam, monsieur, sir, madam, how this name was given to me was, I was christened Parrot because my hair was cut carrot, because my skin was burned to feathers, and when I tumbled down into the whaler, the coxswain yelled, 'Here's a parrot, Captain.' So it seems you have your answer, but you don't. I'd been named Parrot as a child when my skin was still pale and tender as a maiden's breast, and I was still Parrot in 1793 when Olivier de Blabas Garmont was not even a twinkle in his father's eye. To belabour the point, sir, I was and am distinctly senior to that unborn child. In 1793, the French were chopping off each other's heads, and I was already 12 years of age, and my endodermis naturalis had become scrubbed and hardened by the wind and mists of Dartmoor, from whose vastness my da and I never strayed too far. I had tramped behind my darling father down muddy lanes, and I was still called Parrot when he, Jack Larrett, carried me on his shoulder through Northgate at Totnes. My daddy loved his parrot. He would sit me on the bar at the King's Bridge Inn to let the punters hear what wonders came from my amazing mouth. Man is born free and is everywhere in chains. Now, if that ain't worth sixpence, what is? My daddy was a journeyman printer, a lanky man with big knees and nubbly knuckled hands, with which he would rough up his red hair when looking for first principles. Inside this bird's nest, it was a surprise to find his small white noggin, the precious engine of his bright grey eyes. Children remain tied to their father by nature only so long as they need him for their preservation. As soon as this ends, so wrote the Great Rousseau, the natural bond is dissolved. And there's a longer quote, which I think is sort of boring for tonight, so I'm not going to do it all. But the Rousseau says that they will stay together if they do, the father and the child, only by mutual agreement. And Parrot says, more or less, that's it. My daddy and I were two peas in a pod. The acquisition of knowledge was our occupation, but of my ma I knew nothing except that she had a tiny waist which would fit inside her husband's hands. I missed it all my life. I knew Adam Smith before I reached fractions. Then I was put to Latin, which my father liked no more than I did, and this caused us considerable upset, both with ourselves and with each other. It was due to Latin that my father got an estate and clipped my lug hole, and I grabbed a half-burned bit of kindling and set to drawing on the floor. I'd never seen a drawing in my life, and when I saw what I was doing, dear God, I thought I had invented it. And what rage, what fury, what a delicious humming wickedness I felt, all over the floor, and who'll clean it? I had seen my daddy's hand reach for his belt buckle, and I was ipso facto ready for the slap. Yet at this moment I entered a foreign jungle of the soul. I drew a man with a dirty long nose, a leaping trout, a donkey falling upside down. But my daddy's belt stayed in his trousers. He stared at me. His hair stood up like taffy. He cocked his head. I permitted him to take my charcoal stick and kiss me on the head. Not a cross word, or a kind one. He led the parrot downstairs where he ordered the landlord pour me a ginger beer. Then he sat and watched me drink. And what was he pondering, do you reckon? Why, the benefits of having an engraver in the family. So the notion of him being an engraver is remains sort of ambiguous, but one, there are a couple of things really come out of this moment, and one of them is that we understand that Parrot really would love to be an engraver, and there begins a sort of a sense of his ambition that he might be an artist of some sort. And we, that is, Parrot and I, thought for a long time that this was to be the case, and I think we were both very disappointed and upset when it seemed that this could no longer be true. He also goes, they work together in a sort of a highly illegal printery together in Devon, where it seems the engravers do some slightly illegal things, and well, we'll leave that. So, to leap ahead minutes and years, past the point where they have reason, where the paths of their lives lead them together, and where Parrot, by then in Paris, a sort of a servant, secretary, factotum for a French aristocrat who, to make it easy for you to remember later, has only one arm. That's who I'm talking about. And so through working for this particular man, who happens to be the lover, we think, although even the writer's not quite sure, of Olivier's mother, Parrot finds himself appointed to take Olivier to America, where he will investigate the nature of prisons in the New World. Really, we understand it's to really get him out of the way of political trouble. And this is a family traumatised by these sorts of political troubles. Parrot does not like and does not want to go with Olivier. And to let you know, in case it becomes important, I can't remember, his lover, Mathilde, an artist of some talent, will also be on this journey. Yes, it will matter. He refers to, Parrot refers to Olivier by all sorts of sort of insulting sort of names, like Lord Migraine and Lord Pintledy-Pantledy and other similar things. And that's... So this is, we're on the boat to America. We've left out so much, I'm completely unnerved. This will be the first time Olivier meets Americans, and Parrot's role on the boat is to take dictation, to be a spy for Olivier's mother, but also to take dictation because Parrot's handwriting's so awful. Okay, he's been talking to Americans. Migraine suddenly shouted he would write an entire book about Americans. He loudly declared them the most interesting creatures he had ever seen. It was difficult to guess what he really thought, but he began to interview them one by one, as if it was an agricultural occasion and he must check their weight and teeth and breeding and know who the sire and who the dame. And all this he recorded in his notebook. And it was my great privilege, when he was done, to transcribe his scrawl into the journey, and in all cases have a carbon copy, yes, carbon paper was invented, have a carbon copy which would be sent as safety back to France. I doubt his prying mother ever found anything to make her fear for her baby's safety. Indeed, I wondered if she had the fortitude to read the tedious stuff. Was she even curious enough, I wonder, to endure that very long conversation, some of which later found its way into the famous book, wherein the pious manufacturer of nails asks the French commissioner to imagine France in its natural state, that is, one in which any piece of land is available to whoever is man enough to work it. When there is enough for all, the nail maker said, there is no need for government. But what of the poor? Asks Olivier. No man who will work can be poor. The great man peed beside my ear in the middle of the night. I did not complain. He preened and postured. I played my part. But when I saw how he had his eye on Mathilde, I thought, I will sit on his chest and stuff his mouth with dirt. She was a clever little thing, Mathilde. She painted the Peake daughters without anyone paying her very much attention, and by the time she was doing Mr Peake, she had a following. Foremost among her admirers was Lord Migraine, and it was a horror for a man who loves a woman to see this flirtation acted out before his eyes. It did not matter how often I fled or how hard I pulled my pillow across my ears. They were now always in conversation, the pair of them. And when at last the dance was done, when he had reluctantly assented to the portrait, when they set up shop inside my own bloody cabin, I was on the rack. I'd leave them alone. I'd play cards, but for Christ's sake, they would then insist I attend to them. "Garçon!" cried he. At this command I must enter my own cabin, inhale the oil and turpentine, the perfume of our love, our nights, our days. Mathilde stood at the far end of the cabin and affected to wash her brush. I could not look at her. Lord Migraine twisted his skinny body in his chair and asked me, had I packed his bloody purse? Well, frig you for a Dutchman, I thought. "No, sir," I said, "no purse, sir." And this was true. "No coins, monsieur? No specie?" He was acting the cool master, but he was all a twitter. I twisted the knife, asking him what arrangements he had made with the American banks. Arrangements? His cheeks reddened as he held my murderous gaze. "It was the Comtesse de Garmont who made the arrangements. You heard her. She insisted on it." "I do believe she wished to, yes, but I never saw her do it." I held his gaze and did not tell him it was I, Monsieur's secrétaire, who had written the letters of introduction to the Bank of New York. And of course, I knew exactly where they were. If I were to search for some instrument among his trunks, I told him, the cabin must be evacuated. They must leave, the pair of them. "Or not," I said. "I could search another day." "Now," he demanded. Mathilde was thus evicted. In being forced to pass me, she gave a savage bump with her formerly familiar behind. So what Parrot has done, well, perhaps this will explain. Afterwards you can tell me how all this has gone, you know, whether it's sort of some coherent pattern is emerging. So they've arrived in New York, and Mr Peake, who is the head of a New York bank, a farmer's son from Staten Island, which sort of scandalises Olivier that somebody who is the son of a farmer could end up being the head of the most prominent bank in New York. And he's even more sort of disgusted when Mr Peake says, really, it's not all that different from farming. But anyway, they've both in different ways been very upset with Parrot's behaviour on the ship, and Mr Peake has formally promised to have him arrested immediately they arrive in New York. And so as the boat, the ship is docking down near Cortlandt Street, they have discovered that in fact that Parrot is co-signatory to the financial instrument that will give Olivier his money in America. And Olivier and Mr Peake is sort of rather disgusted. You know, the little lawyer shouldn't have read this thing. "Did you not read it?" he says. "I'm a lawyer, sir." And so there they are. So Mr Peake says, "We will find your man." He says, "We will make peace with him," because they can't put him in jail anymore. Olivier says, "I found the deck crowded with a musty, malodorous humanity that had hitherto been kept below. Across their shoulders, behind their sad, battered, stacked portmanteaus, I made out New York, a great deal of bright yellow, sappy wood, a vast pile of bricks, a provincial town in the process of being built or broken. I put my goods into the care of a large black man. If he was a slave or a porter, I did not know. Only that he put my trunk upon his shoulder and tucked my valise under his arm, and with no regard for the delicacy of the first-class passengers, rammed his way down the gangplank, beckoning me to follow him. When I had, by necessity, mimicked his rude jostling, I arrived in limbo, not quite ashore, not quite on land, the long, open-sided warehouse built atop a jetty. I looked for Peake. He was nowhere to be seen. Ahead of me, I could see the servant's, Parrot's, frightful hair. But by now the black giant had brought me to an official and delivered my baggage to his table. Having opened each item to facilitate inspection, the porter demanded money. I explained to him that I had only a letter of credit on the Bank of New York. Although it was clearly a ridiculous thing for me to do, and I could imagine my mother rolling her eyes upward to see such behaviour from a garçon. I showed the document to the damn porter, whose huge black face contorted itself in the most frightening effect. I asked the official to intercede, saying that if he would provide the porter's name, I would return tomorrow with the coins. Anxious that my co-signatory was escaping me, I'm afraid that I'd rather thrust my letter at the official's face, thus causing unintended offence. He and the slave were then both joined in war against me, and I was subjected to all the tyranny that a petty official can bring against his social better. As a consequence, I was detained almost an hour while my possessions were carefully inspected, one by one. By the time the valise had been disemboweled, and I had been interrogated about the exact nature of my nobility, how I stood in relation to the Republic, and if I was for General Lafayette or against him, all of which I answered diplomatically, even though such questions had no more standing than a generally agreed desire that nobles were to be shown their place. And then I'd lost sight of both my ally and my servant. When my ordeal was over, I still had no clinking stuff. I was therefore compelled to carry my own luggage to the place where I saw Peake awaiting me. My progress was maliciously observed by the dull and hostile eyes of a dozen porters, not one of whom could be persuaded to rise from his haunches, not even by Peake, who chastised the ruffians for their lack of hospitality to a friend of the revolution. Sorry for laughing. So, to pick up on the nature of being a French aristocrat, one of the aspects of being a French aristocrat in New York at that year, because if there were people who were hostile and unimpressed, there were certainly many, many people who were very, very impressed. And I think I'm not going to read to you about that aspect of it tonight. So this is Parrot, his first night in New York, or second night, and he's on Broadway. He's gone out by himself. Second or third. He's actually been. Olivier actually has been coming to call on him in his boarding house, and the servant has shown no interest in going to meet his visitor. So we can guess that Olivier is in something of a panic about his money, and that Parrot really would rather have nothing much to do with him still. Parrot. I entered into the white gas stream of Broadway, but could not see the silver North River and the dark East River flowing like mercury in the night. And how could I guess what was occurring that very hour in the unlit streets around the Bowery, where there was a murky, smoking, red-flecked flow of life, not ants, but human beings, a living mass of men roaring south toward me. I later learned that the city fathers had locked about 300 pigs inside the Canal Street pound. I'd seen a notice in the street, but what were pigs to me? The city would no longer tolerate the swine whom their improvident owners let wander the streets, where they relieved themselves in public and fornicated without shame. The people's pigs had been stolen from them, and as a result there was extreme social agitation around the pound. All the angry owners of the pigs, some armed with hammers, others with crowbars, others with no more than a skinful of John Barleycorn, had been drawn towards this enclosure like filings to a magnet. So as I innocently wondered about the price of a dozen New York oysters, some 100 pigs were stampeding into genteel Hudson Square, and a greater number of men were stumbling, falling, hollering. One wished only to retrieve his own pig and lead him home, another to steal a new pig, but most had no other ambition than to share the joy of the chase. I heard them coming
I suppose, but I'd lived so many years in Paris, I thought the roar of voices to be nothing but a boxing match nearby. On the corner of Broadway, along Chambers Street, I saw a strange sight. A French noble whose cloak did not obscure the gold embroidery shining bright as Jesus in the gas. He carried a silver-capped stick in his inky right hand and an untidy pile of papers beneath his left arm. I'd forgotten that Lord Migraine was short-sighted, so when he did not see me, I assumed he meant to cut me. Why not? It must be clear by now I had no intention of being his second signatory. But then I saw he was not cutting me at all. He offered me his hand. "Which way do you walk?" he asked. As he was once again attempting English, I was slow to understand him. He said, "I trust Mrs. Larrett has recovered?" In the course of this very short conversation, we had walked a block, and so we were on the corner of Murray Street, when the swine and their fellows arrived on top of us. Murray was dark, but Broadway was lit from the Battery up to the Delphi Theatre. So although I pulled him into the doorway, the bright light caught his fancy coat, and that was jewel enough to halt the whole stampede, or that part of it composed of a great hulking Irishman and his Carib friend, who immediately demanded that the aristocrat tell him who he was and where he came from. "I am Olivier de Gaumont," he said in a haughty style not well suited to his situation. "I'm a friend of General Lafayette." To which the Carib wished to know how it was his head had not been taken off his shoulders many years before. The little fellow stepped full into the light, and with that largeness of gesture that marks French theatrical speech, declared himself a student of democracy. Alas, his listeners knew nothing of the French or the theatre. They were drunk and probably affronted that he did not have the grace to act afraid. "You little cur of spit!" cried the Irishman, and wrapped his arm around the slender neck and dragged him into Murray Street, wrenching him so violently that papers and stick went flying into the dark. I searched for his stick and found it by its silver knob, but by this time the two large men were sending him between them back and forth like a shuttlecock and singing. They sing the Marseillaise. I'm not going to do that for you. I can't. You don't want me to sing. Migraine seemed not to understand the deadly intention of the song. Silver knob or no, his lordship's stick was too light to be a useful weapon. Chance brought me a decent length of lumber, 4 inches by 2 inches, I would say. This instrument I brought down upon the Carib's arm. Lord, what a crack! Urgently the fellow held his limb against his chest, bestowing upon me in complete silence a look of inexorable outrage. "Kindly bash the bugger, Jim," said he, or words to that effect. I was a fair height and I was strong enough, but the Irishman was taller and heavier. I later read he was a ferry driver, famous for his foul mouth and violent possession of disputed wharves. Soon he would be a millionaire. Now he was about to murder me. The Irishman had raised his ringed fist. "Lord Jesus!" interrupted the Carib, and sat down suddenly. "Allez!" cried Lord Migraine. I did not have to turn my head to see the Frenchman's arm. It was extended parallel to the earth, and at one end there was a pistol with an 8-inch barrel. "No," I said, for I did not see how he had time to prime it. "Allez, vous-en!" The Irishman began to laugh, and that was his miscalculation, for it produced a flash of flame, and he was violently pushed backwards on his heels. "You," he said, clutching at himself. It was clear he had taken a ball in the shoulder. "Now," said my surprising ally to our two assailants, "maintenant, rentrez chez vous." It was clear I had much to learn about Olivier de Gaumont. Well, lots of things happened as a result of that, not least that
poor Parrot is the one who is sent to jail, and Olivier is the one who comes and gets him out, and that's, I guess, reason enough for some sort of friendship to begin, at least. One of the I just read you a couple of small things which are sort of really to do with, I mean, Olivier will end up falling in love with an American and falling in love with America. But he does carry with him, as I said, that also Tocqueville did, you know, enormous amounts of prejudice. So let me just, this is just a little grab, it's just a paragraph to give you a taste. Almost any time in this book you find Olivier being sort of, you know, vile and snobbish, you can be pretty sure I didn't make it up, that I stole it from a Frenchman long ago. The Americans quickly revealed themselves to be obsessed with trade and money, and beyond the walls of that particular cell, they simply could not see anything that diminished their enthusiasm for self-congratulation. They'd got their hands on a mighty continent from which the least of them could, by dint of some effort, extract unlimited wealth. There was so much to be extracted, it scarcely mattered how or if they were governed, because there is no need to argue when there is plenty for all. The energy put into this quest for wealth left little room for anything one might think of as culture, and so marked was this lack that I would always, in speaking of the wealthier families, use the English term middle class and never bourgeois. There was, as they were continually pleased to tell me, no aristocracy required. So this is just the nasty stuff. I'll give you another bit. There is a observation in this about rocking chairs, which I'm sure you have not read any reviews mentioning it, or indeed any reviews at all. But as the business about the rocking chair was my invention, I'm really take it ill when people say it was Tocqueville's. It was not. So this is part of their travels, and in this part of the travel, they're travelling by steamboat from Philadelphia. And Olivier is hot to see his beloved, and he is travelling with his servant, of course. That Tuesday morning, Captain Kammer's steamboat, Zeus, carrying sufficient fuel to feed her boilers all the way to New Haven, departed the Crooked Billet Wharf. No matter its name, it proceeded out into the bay like a floating sack of firewood. The picture was less dire below decks, where I followed my servant's dripping path into a large public cabin with curtained windows in the style of a Broadway oyster house. Along the bulkheads on each side were banks of settees that would later be converted into berths. Aft the cabin was the violent engine compartment, and aft of that two smaller cabins, one of which I engaged for my drowned Englishman, who continued to hold his Versailles impromptu. Well, you don't need to worry about that, blah, blah, blah. For myself, I took the deluxe cabin, not on account of its size, which was not so considerable, but for the big windows that stretched across at the square transom stern. Here, in this compartment, perfectly constructed for the contemplations of the American sublime, was placed the inevitable machine, that awful monument to democratic restlessness, a rocking chair. Oh, Blackfield, I wish you were here to see these Americans. They are the most turbulent, unpeaceful, least contented people, far worse than Italians and Greeks. Clearly, there is nothing less suited to meditation than democracy. You will never find, as in aristocracies, one class that sits back in its own comfort, and another that will not stir itself because it despairs of ever improving its status. In America, everyone is in a state of agitation, some to attain power, others to grab wealth, and when they cannot move, they rock. They dig canals, they tear along rivers in a rage of machinery, the engines pumping like sawyers in a pit, the shores denuded of their ancient trees. Napoleon restored the fortunes of France by plunder, and a similar economic principle is here being enacted.
the mower splintering the scythe, the smokestack eating up the wind, and there will be acres more of it to pillage if President Jackson has his way. It is strange in New York and Philadelphia to see the feverish enthusiasm which accompanies the Americans' pursuit of prosperity, and the way they are ceaselessly tormented by the vague fear that they have failed to choose the shortest route to achieve it. I have it from Duponceau that the restless Benjamin Franklin, who supposedly taught himself 5 languages, invented bifocal glasses and the lightning rod, is responsible for the awful rocking chair. I had that particular horror removed from the deluxe cabin and replaced it with a comfortable wing-back reading chair, which would not rock no matter how heavily I sat in it. Having arranged all the papers on my bed, I spread my leather case upon my lap, and there, all physical excitements aside, prepared to enjoy my memory of she towards whom the churning wheels propelled me. And I'll read you one last little bit. And this is going back a little bit, but it's him going to visit Mr. Peake's farm in New York, and there he will meet Amelia, who the wheels will later churn in favour of. This is the first moment that he really, really begins to consider that there might be something to think about in America. Several days thereafter, I returned to my boarding house to find Mr. Parrot waiting on the stoop. "Sir," said the former prisoner, rising slowly to his feet, "I have decided to remain in your service." "Oh no, I'm not reading from there at all, I'm sorry." But it just goes on, we'll skip a little bit. It was, so they're going, the Parrot tells him they've been invited to see Mr. Peake at his farm. "It was not hot enough to make my nose bleed, but it was a very rough journey to Peake's farm, which was located on what may have become by now, if the New York Commissioner's street plan has any real authority, land bordered by East 48th on the south and East 56th on the north. Emerging in bad temper from the wilderness, I found a silky driveway, a wooded ravine, a mature orchard, a clear, narrow, rocky stream running through native grasses. We rattled across a dam wall, came upon a rise from which we enjoyed the grand prospects across the East River to Blackwell's Island. Were my spirits lifted? Not at all. Along the shores of a little cove grew a number of pretty little trees in low situations, quite green, very still, and through the leaves the white sand of a beach. I viewed them sourly. When in a moment I beheld the Peake mansion, I was pleased only because its size reduced the old woman, never mind who she is, to silence. In the grand foyer, I renewed my acquaintance with Mrs. Peake and her stringy daughters. "So," said my creditor immediately, "we must take the tour." This, it appears, is the American custom, to escort one's visitors from room to room, like an auctioneer. Even the meanest object will have some story and the grandest one's a price. I noted that the so-called library held no books. The furniture had been copied from engravings, and of the 6 paintings in the 34 rooms, 3 of them had been painted aboard the ship. And this was the home of one of New York's foremost citizens. The arches into the dining room were trimmed with green and autumn leaves. Entering, one was immediately confronted by a great number of vases, also dressed with autumn leaves. Everything, in short, was very gay. The native flora was not, however, the room's chief decoration, for that was a friend of the 2 daughters, Miss Godfrey, a visitor from Connecticut, who clearly carried in her veins the triumph of those Vikings who had raided the English Isles so many centuries before, and whose miscegenation had produced such startling effects that 300 years later they had been the subject of those mad maps of hair colour bequeathed to my mother by her brother Astolphe. Seeing Miss Godfrey, my opinion of New York was changed immediately. That a creature like this one should walk the earth, straw-haired, blue-eyed, straight-backed, tall, strong, like a goddess, but modest and gracious, perhaps even a little shy. At the meal, she was somehow placed between Mrs. Parrot and her mother, while the Peake girls regaled me with what I do not know. I gave these two girls my full attention, noticing only that they both told me that Miss Godfrey was a daughter of Mr. Philip Godfrey, who sat on the board of the Wethersfield prison. He's there to investigate prisons. What could be more perfect? There was food, we ate. There was piano and flute. The Miss Peake's voices had not improved since the ship. After dinner, I strolled with the master in his grounds, admired his pigs, and discussed my forthcoming trips to Philadelphia and Albany. So the best part of the afternoon was gone before I found myself with Miss Godfrey. How this happened, I have no idea. I was delighted, shocked that this impropriety should be so easily permitted, fearing that my companion would notice how far we had strayed from the terrace, where I noted Peake in deep conversation with Parrot. Around us was the American autumn, in all its drunken wildness, like the colours of a savage, or that impossible bird, the Antipodean cassowary, whose likeness Monsieur had sold to my mother while pretending it was a gift. Beyond the drive were carpets of green moss covered with red leaves. Miss Godfrey and I walked side by side, and now, so far enough from the house that no soul could see us, she spoke to me quietly in French. Good Lord, what music, what an endearing way to speak. She was sorry she did not have her Molière, so I could read it to her as it should be read, not in her poor colonial voice. Was she flirting? To ask the question is to not understand her. She took each step as the first one of a dance. She kicked the red leaves and made them rise like birds. By the shoreline I saw Peake in close conversation with both paroquets. What devilry he planned I could not say, nor could I hope to intercede. I had arrived quite unexpectedly in paradise, enclosed by a landscape that no painter could portray. Before my eyes lay, or rather shone, magnificent New York. At every moment, steamships passed. America. Thank you. All these readings involve some sort of major betrayal of the work, but almost everything else I've ever written, one could read a first chapter or a second chapter, and one would have some idea of what was to come. So there we go. Each man kills the thing he loves. It was. I mean, it's very difficult to be a writer and to live in the world. And I decided the day almost within weeks of entering advertising that I was going to be a writer. And so all the time I was working in advertising, when everybody thought I was a copywriter, I knew I was a novelist. It's very hard to convince people, particularly at parties when they become abusive. But I knew, and so after that, and it never ever occurred to me that I might really be able to make a living from writing, particularly to be an Australian writer in the 60s. If you sold a short story to a literary magazine, for $20, you would done pretty well. And Australian writers, with the exception of Patrick White, did not seem to me to be well known outside the country. So things changed, and really it was when I was able to afford
to be a writer, then I was. And I got out of advertising, I was the only one that knew I was a writer, I guess. That's all. Anyway, thank you all very, very much.